Welcome to Centered Presents The Future of Health. Join me, Christina Waleka, along with Dr. Molly Brown, as we dive deep into the world of brain-based wellness.
In each episode, we will explore cutting-edge insights and practical techniques that empower you to achieve optimal health and super high-energy living.
Tune in and start your journey toward a healthier, more vibrant you.
Welcome to our podcast. Centered Presents The Future of Health explores solution and results-based care. This podcast is on something I have personally developed quite a passion for, cold plunging. We are so excited to welcome Thomas Seager, cold plunge revolutionary and creator of the Morozko Forge Cold Plunge, to discuss the benefits of cold plunging on this episode. When Joe Rogan cited Tom's stats on increasing testosterone through cold plunging, it swept the nation. A common practice in Scandinavia, Americans are now embracing the practice. Never did I think I would be a cold plunger. Now I crave acute cold exposure wherever I am and all throughout the world. The mental, physical, and energetic results I've gotten from a regular practice of cold plunging, preferably in the natural rivers and lakes of my home state in Idaho, has been incredible. I am hooked and the practice is contagious. We had the pleasure to recently visit the Morozko Forge warehouse in Arizona, and these cold plunges are meticulously crafted, ozonated, and grounded. The experience is exhilarating. The Morozko plunge is my favorite, just after the natural bodies of water. Our podcast showcases anecdotal case studies behind the practice of the plunge. Plunging is a proactive lifestyle choice that leaves you empowered, energized, and full of positive focus. As Tom explains, it has the possibility to bring miraculous results in hormone balance, thyroid function, blood sugar regulation, and many stories of cancer clearing through the regular practice of cold plunging. As we look towards the future of healthcare, a future that empowers individuals, prevents chronic illness and pain, regulates and calms the nervous system, the practice of cold plunging is here to stay. Please enjoy our episode with myself, Christina Waleka, and Tom Seager.
Welcome to Centered Presents The Future of Health. On today's episode, we are lucky enough to be joined by Dr. Thomas Seager. Dr. Seager is an associate professor in the School of Sustainable Engineering and the Built Environment at Arizona State University, where he dives deep into the fascinating realms of human resilience, personal psychology, and entrepreneurship. As the founder of Morozko Cold Plunge, Dr. Seager is not just an engineer, he is a pioneer in harnessing the power of cold therapy for health and recovery. With over 150 scientific articles to his name, Dr. Seager has dedicated his career to studying the effects of cold exposure on the body. From boosting metabolic rates and enhancing physical performance to improving brain concentration, memory, and even increasing libido, cold plunge therapy offers a range of advantages that can elevate our overall well-being. Join us as we dive into Dr. Seager's journey from the engineering world to the forefront of health innovation, discussing the science behind these benefits, the impact of his work, and how you can incorporate these practices into your own life. Please help us welcome Dr. Thomas Seager to today's episode of Centered Presents The Future of Health. Hi, Dr. Seager. Thank you so much for joining us today. And as we get started, if you wouldn't mind explaining to those who don't know, how do you go from the engineering world to the forefront of health innovation?
Yeah, this is a great question because it seems like an unusual trajectory, Christina. I'm an engineer. I have a doctorate in civil and environmental engineering. And so I make machines. I don't work inside the body like a medical doctor would. I work outside the body like an engineer does. At the origins of my profession, environmental engineering, is public health. It would be the cholera epidemic. For example, in London, there's a wonderful book called The Ghost Map about the genesis of environmental engineering, where a medical doctor put up on the wall a map of London and put a pin in where all the cholera deaths during this epidemic were located. And the pins clustered geographically around this one well. And so the doctor said, remove the handle from the pump on the well. And people got better. That was the moment that, at least in this Western developed world, we realized that water could carry infectious disease. And a whole sort of profession of environmental engineering has grown out of that realization to give people clean air and clean water and a clean environment in which to live so that the public remains healthy. I think we've gotten away from that in my profession. I certainly got away from that, and not not like in a bad way. I was studying infrastructure systems and natural disasters and recovery from floods and hurricanes, all wonderful things. But then the worst disaster of all hit us in 2020, and it was the COVID lockdowns. This was a different kind of public health crisis, but it reminded me of the cholera epidemic. And I thought, what does my profession of environmental engineering have to contribute to this public health crisis? And my colleagues all said nothing. It's somebody else's problem. It's for the epidemiologists, and it's for the medical doctors, and it's for the mental health professionals to sort through the aftermath and all the damage of the lockdowns. And I said, no, it's not. We have a responsibility to get back to our public health roots. And I'm going to reorient my career away from the concrete and the steel and the highways that make up civil engineering infrastructure. And I'm going to focus on the people. What are the machines and the technologies that we can bring to people who are suffering from metabolic disorder, or suffering from autoimmune diseases, or suffering from major depression, or suffering from thyroid dysfunction? And the first one, of course, is the ice bath, because our bodies are wired to expect cold. Our mitochondria need cold because they need brown fat. Brown fat works with the thyroid. Brown fat secretes neuroprotective factors that keep your brain healthy. Brown fat regulates your metabolism. And all of these things, when they become dysfunctional, are associated with low mood, mental health disorders, and increased rates of aging. So my career was kind of changed for me when they locked me out of my classroom and made me teach on Zoom, and created this mental health crisis that has now become the focus of what I do as an engineer.
One of the questions I had for you, and you kind of jumped ahead, but what innovations do you foresee in sustainable healthcare practices, and how might they impact patient outcomes?
It is a good question, because right now there are two competing visions of healthcare in the United States. They're somewhat antagonistic to one another, but I think they could be complementary. Here's the first vision. I think it'll be familiar to you. All we need to do is super sequence the human genome and identify each individual variations in our chromosomes and our microbiological expression of the alleles or whatever, to get the phenotype that we want as it is expressed in the gene editing, personalized medicine, high technology, blah, 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 blah. Now, I'm not an advocate of that approach, but there are billions of dollars in venture capital, in research, pouring themselves into a better understanding of the DNA that is in the nucleus. I think they're looking in the wrong place. I'd rather they look at mitochondria rather than in the nucleus. Mitochondria have their own DNA, and nobody's bothering to sequence that, and it is essential to human health and well-being. However, the competing vision of healthcare is, here's the high technology vision. The competing vision is back to nature. We don't need to insert in our own DNA those things that make us better adapted to such a broken environment. We don't need a DNA that will work in our light pollution, our toxic chemical pollution, our seed oil diet pollution. We don't need to adapt our DNA to this crappy Western industrialized lifestyle that disconnects us from nature. So the competing view is get back to nature, create the environment around the human being that is more typical of the 200,000, some years of Homo sapiens on this planet, depending upon your view and what you believe in the origin. Get back to the Garden of Eden, even if it's only a metaphor, and give people the diet, the exercise, the sleep, the light, the environment that they need, because inside, we're fine. It's outside. For the most part, it's outside that is broken. Now, these two competing views, you can imagine, one of them is centralized, well-funded, capable of creating intellectual property that will motivate venture capitalists, capable of government capture in corporations, and it fuels the universities. I'm a faculty member at Arizona State, and I can't write a proposal to the National Science Foundation or the National Institute of Health that says, Well, I want $1 billion to bring people out into the forest because all of the clinical data and the epidemiological data shows that they're in a better mood, they heal faster, like they're healthier just by getting 3 or 4 hours of forest bathing. Nobody's going to patent that, and there's no return on investment. So you can see how one view has the support of the kind of vested capitalist interests, and the other view is diminished as countercultural. I'm between the two. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. I can't get out to the forest. I mean, I live in the desert, for goodness sakes. I don't have access to the cold, not like you do. You say there's 4 inches of snow, and I'm getting jealous. I'll have maybe 2 weeks of winter where I live. Sometimes you have to bring nature to the human being because I'm not ready to give up my sort of high technology lifestyle, my apartment, my heated leather seats in my SUV, or whatever these comfortable things are that are ultimately making me sick. Sometimes you have to bring the cold using the machine to the person. I'm so far away from the ocean, but I can put Epsom salt and I can put potassium sulfate and zinc sulfate into my Morozko, and I can create a cold salt bath, which is the next best thing to going body surfing in the Pacific Ocean. I can create a green light to bring the phototherapy of the forest into my own eyes inside my apartment. So I'm between these two competing visions of the future of healthcare, the high tech and the sort of back to nature. They can be compatible if we are creating the machines that are the next best thing to nature.
Yeah, and I think that you prove a really good point there. And as we look at a lot of underserved areas around the world, but also like the mental health crisis and the healthcare crisis in general, the beautiful thing about what you're doing is, again, just exposing the work of being in the cold and how good it is for your body, along with like the grounding in the earth and the sunlight and everything you talked about and just the benefits. And again, like we obviously need to see changes in our current healthcare system.
I think it's interesting you brought up how, disease is carried through water, but also consciousness is carried through water. So I think carrying that consciousness in your cold plunge is what's one of the things that sets your plunge apart, correct?
Yes, but I'm going to kind of, I want to talk about the consciousness part first, and then I want to get to some of the material parts that you're asking about. Because I'm a physical scientist and an engineer, my profession has what I call a materialistic fetish. If we can't see it, measure it, weigh it, if it's not thermodynamic in some way, we pretend it doesn't exist. And that is an impoverishment of what you're talking about, sort of this consciousness. Because what's even more important than the material is the meaning making. What does the experience mean to us? Well, people lose sight of the fact that we are formed in water, at conception. We gestate for 9 months in water. And it's in this incredible miracle, right? We grow lungs while we're in the womb. Like, what are those for? But we know it all makes sense because we have this experience. And then the baby is born. Water births have outstanding outcomes. I mean, if you look at the clinical data, and you must prevent the water from being too warm. You cannot put a pregnant woman, in a hot tub or something like this. It's bad for her. It's bad for the baby. You must keep the water cool enough. And it has an analgesic effect, and it has a calming effect. And in general, the birth outcomes are better. But some part of us is like, but then the baby is born underwater. What you don't know is that human babies are born with an instinct to swim. They're not born with an instinct to to walk. Like, if you see one of these National Geographic specials and the little giraffe baby comes out, and then 30 seconds later, it's up on its spindly legs and it's like walking. It's an amazing thing. Human babies aren't like that. Human babies swim when they're born, and they can exercise that instinct. They know not to breathe until their face is no longer wet. They come out of the water. And, there's the old, like, the physician slaps them on the butt and then they take their first breath. That's okay. But their face hits the air. And now they know they are wired with this instinct to breathe. If that isn't a spiritual experience, I don't know what is. There is a reason that religions talk about rebirth, or the baptism tradition in Christianity is to go back to the water. Of course, we have a spiritual relationship with the water, and we can feel the difference. When the water is grounded, for example, it discharges the excess electrons, or at least the electron imbalance between our bodies and between the earth that will build up when we're in rubber soles, or when we're driving around in our cars with rubber tires, when we're insulated from the earth. People report to me that Morozko feels different. And it's not just because of the temperature. Even if you were to take the Morozko up to like 40 degrees, it feels different because it's not an acrylic tub. It's a metal tub. And that metal tub is connected to ground. As soon as you get in, you are electrically balanced with the earth. And we've measured this. So if you do have a material fetish, like the engineers do, then you need a meter, and you're going to measure voltages and current, and 30 times more effective than being barefoot on the grass. That's what happens when you get into the Morozko. It is an instantaneous rebalancing your electric charge with the earth, and that changes the way you feel. It's no wonder you think you're having a spiritual experience, because your heart rate comes down lower. The viscosity of your blood improves, which increases your circulation and makes you less prone to blood clots. And you can't help but feel that change in your polarity. So there's a couple of things happen. Physiological, yes, those changes exist and there are measurable aspects of it. But spiritual, those changes, they happen at a deeper level at which we know we feel connected. We know we feel right with the world, because if you believe we're in a simulation, that's what we're programmed for. And if you don't believe we're in a simulation, then I probably don't have to convince you of the experience.
One thing you hit on was, again, like you talked about the birth, and a question I wanted to ask you was, there are studies, I've done a little bit of reading about men versus women and the cold plunge. Do you have any opinions on that? What have you found beneficial as women? You also talk about like 11 minutes being the right amount of time. So where does that number come from?
The men versus women question was popularized by Stacy Sims. She's a PhD, and I forget exactly her field, but she appeared on the Huberman podcast. Now, Stacy works with ultra marathoners and triathletes, and she has noticed that there are differences between the male body and the female body, as if, we needed a doctoral program to indicate this. But the fact is that you kind of do these days, because there's so many people out there trying to pretend that men and women are somehow interchangeable, or that we're the same, that it really helps to be able to differentiate physiologically between the two. And when Stacy works with these ultra athletes, these women, she says, look, you can't just adapt a male training protocol for women and say, oh, that's going to be optimal. When you are trying to achieve at this extreme level, you must take into account the physiological differences and design a program specifically for women. And this all sounds like extremely insightful. And I will defer to her judgment on anything related to like female triathletes, because it's not my area of expertise. And then she says to Huberman, yeah, I don't really like the cold. And that has nothing to do with clinical trials or physiological differences. She makes 2 points, which are correct. Women report being more sensitive to cold water than men. And that sensitivity changes at different times of their cycle. That's I'm going to say that's a fact. That doesn't say anything about one individual woman, but women in general, that's a fact. We have trials that indicate that. But the other thing that's true, which Stacy Sims is aware of because she's also cited it, is that women respond to cold training faster than men. That is, they acclimate to the cold more quickly than men do. And this raises a new scientific question. Do women report greater sensitivity because of, basic physiological differences? Or do they report greater sensitivity because they are less cold exposed, as a population than men are? I don't know, maybe the men are out playing touch football, or maybe they're the ones shoveling the sidewalk on a day like today or something, or plowing the driveways or whatever. For whatever reason, as a population, men may be more cold acclimated than women, and women catch up fast when you put them in the cold. The danger in Stacy Sims saying, yeah, I don't really like cold for my athletes, women should go a little bit warmer than men. The danger is that women may misunderstand the benefits of the cold that are specific to them. And I'm going to give you one example. The leading cause of infertility among women who otherwise would be of childbearing age is PCOS, polycystic ovarian syndrome. And so these are when cysts form near the ovaries, and they put extra pressure on the ovaries. They can stimulate the ovaries, for example, to produce too much testosterone, and then they can tip the balance to infertility in an otherwise healthy woman. Now, if you hear, Seager saying, oh, the ice bath will improve your mitochondria, they create the steroidal precursors to testosterone from cholesterol in your bloodstream. That's how ice baths boost your testosterone. A woman with PCOS who already has elevated testosterone will say, well, Stacy Sims says I shouldn't do that. Only men should do that. And it's the wrong message, because PCOS is a metabolic disorder. Just like erectile dysfunction in a man is one of the first clinical markers of metabolic disorder, of insulin resistance, PCOS in a woman originates in disorders of the metabolism. When you recruit some brown fat, when you get cold, when you improve your insulin sensitivity, the PCOS resolves. And the testosterone levels can actually come down in a woman from elevated and unhealthy to healthy, and her fertility can be restored. So I'm not trying to pick a fight, with Stacy Sims, PhD. I'm trying to say that her expertise is not in these nuances of cold plunge therapy and what happens to women who are training for the cold rather than training for a triathlon.
It's really interesting because when I first started cold plunging, I definitely don't like the cold. Like I've never liked it. And so, the first time I went up north to like one of the lakes up here, and it was right around this time of year in October, and it was really cold. And I felt so amazing the whole rest of the week that it was like, okay, I think I'm going to start cold plunging. And my goal was to do it maybe 3 mornings a week. And I started feeling so incredible and so focused every day at work, and so in such an elevated and positive state of energy and mood that I crave it every morning now. And I particularly love going in like the rivers and the lakes around here. So, but I can't wait to come to your facility and try your cold plunge.
You're doing it the best way, Molly.
No, I was going to say, you talk a lot. I know a lot about mental resilience, and I too hate being cold. And when I'm outside and not prepared is one thing, but when I'm cold plunging, I'm just challenging myself and like focusing on breathing. And I'm like, I could last 3 minutes, 6 minutes, and I'm not really worried about being cold versus, again, just like being outside and not being comfortable.
You clearly have an understanding of hormetic stress. There are some things we hate that we should never do. For me, it's Fourier transforms. The electrical engineers had to be expert in this sort of advanced calculus technique that, thank goodness, the civil engineers don't have. There are some things that we hate that we should just avoid, and cold is not one of them. Because when you get through that first 15 or 30 seconds of abject panic, and you're like, everything in your nervous system says, get out of here, you are going to die. And then the mammalian dive reflex, sets in, and the parasympathetic tone begins to improve, and your vagus nerve is saying, hey, wait a second, I don't think we're going to die. We're just going to chill out for a little bit. That feeling is moving you towards euphoria. The dopamine is kicking up. The noradrenaline is kicking up. But there are other neurochemicals that aren't mentioned as much because, Huberman doesn't quote them as much. Vasopressin, elevated by the cold. Oxytocin, elevated by the cold. Oxytocin is this bonding hormone that creates tribes. It is the bond between the mother and the newborn. Vasopressin is the hormone associated with familial love. Vasopressin is what we feel, when the dog comes up to us, right? To say, oh, you're so wonderful, I love you too. And this creates in us a hormonal reaction, which is identical to what happens in the cold. It is no wonder that we come out of the stream or the lake or the Morozko and we feel like Superman or Superwoman, like we could do anything because there's so many of these mood-lifting chemicals that are coursing through our body now. It is impossible to come out of a 2-minute freezing cold ice bath in a bad mood. So, right? We should talk about, though, where the 11 minutes comes from. And then we should talk a little bit more about the thyroid. So we're going to talk about the 11 minutes. Ironically, this originates with another woman's research. This is Susanne Soberg, University of Copenhagen. It used to be that medical doctors thought there was no such thing as brown fat in an adult human being. And then this team from Sweden started, seeing these spots on their PET scans. You scan a cancer patient and you're looking for the glucose uptake because that's in a tumor. But they started seeing these things that couldn't possibly be tumors because they were symmetrical in the body. And they said, we think that's brown fat. They were right. Now you can get a whole PhD in a topic that people thought didn't exist 15 years ago. And Susanne Soberg got her PhD in brown fat. She brought these Danish winter swimmers. So, these crazy Danes, they jump in the fjord or something, and then they go into the lab with Susanne Soberg, and she measures them for brown fat. And she saw that she could detect brown fat in people who were regular winter swimmers. So she asked them, how often do you go, fjord jumping? And they said, I go twice a week. I do it on the weekends. I go every day. And she averaged it all out. And she discovered 11 minutes a week. Now, it's possible to take a number like that and amplify it on social media as if it were some kind of optimal truism. And that's not the case at all. It might be less than 11 minutes a week. It will still activate and maintain your brain. We don't know. She just says, look, the average of these people did it was 11 minutes. And so 11 minutes now has the power of some magic number that really just came off a survey of several dozen Danish winter swimmers. We need more research in this area. But what we do know is if you cold plunge every day for 10 to 14 days, you will recruit new brown fat into your body. It is true that some 95% of the American population over 45 years old has zero detectable brown fat. But brown fat can be restored through a regular practice of cold plunge therapy. Your body knows what to do. It will what's called beige white fat cells. It will pack the white fat with new mitochondria, which is what makes them brown, and turn them into repositories of fatty energy, into these fat-burning molecules that fuel your cold thermogenesis. This is a wonderfully healthy thing for a human being who doesn't have brown fat to do. And the reason is the thyroid. There are lots of reasons, but the thyroid is a big one. I think it's about 3% of the American population suffers from some type of thyroid disorder. Two of the more common types might be Graves' disease, which is a hyperactive thyroid. Now it's making too much thyroid hormone. Another one might be Hashimoto's hypothyroiditis, an underactive thyroid. Okay. Of the 3% that suffer from these thyroid disorders, there are more women than there are men. And what they don't know is that the thyroid and brown fat are in constant communication with one another. They were meant to work together inside the body. The thyroid will produce thyroid hormone, but most of it is in the inactive form. It relies upon the brown fat to convert inactive thyroid hormone into the active form of thyroid hormone. So the thyroid is communicating with the brown fat is communicating with the thyroid. They modulate one another. When you lose all brown fat, maybe you've been in Arizona too long, or maybe you live in Florida or Southern California, you never go into the ocean. It is no wonder your metabolism becomes dysregulated. It is no wonder that you develop either hypo or hyperthyroidism. And this has been corrected in several readers who have written to me telling me their story. If it's Graves', their story is, well, the surgeon recommended I have my thyroid removed. But before I did something irrevocable to my body, I thought maybe I would get into the ice bath. Now I have no markers of thyroid or Graves' disease in my bloodstream, and I'm not experiencing the symptoms anymore. Do you think I'm cured? Now, I'm not a medical doctor. I can't tell them that they're cured or not cured. It is likely that if they go back to the conditions that created the disease will return. But why would you go back? It's the same thing with people who have resolved Hashimoto's thyroiditis, hypothyroiditis, by using cold plunge and a ketogenic diet. They recruit new brown fat, they modulate their thyroid function, and all signs of Hashimoto's disappear. All of a sudden, they get a clean bill of health from their lab. If they return to the practices that led to these conditions that made them sick, they'll likely get sick again. But if they stick with those practices, for all practical purposes, they may as well consider themselves cured. This is super important for women to know. If a spa day could cure thyroid disorders, I would say go to Sedona, have a clay cucumber mask and a glass of wine. It feels really good. But that's not the way the body works. If you can tolerate 30 seconds of pain and misery, then your body is going to come out feeling euphoric and you will be healthier.
I love these sort of like case studies that you put out. Is someone collecting this data, or is it just more like people are writing into you? Is there anyone that's actually collecting the data and has a set of numbers on any of this?
I'm doing the best I can, and it's so slow because, this is people writing into me, and we're not doing formal data collection. I have no IRB board for this, so I can't say that I'm doing research. I'm doing journalism, and that sort of gets me out from under the idea that I might be doing something irresponsible by studying human subjects. So I'm not. I'm just collecting stories that people tell me. I'll give you another one. I have a customer who's a friend. He said he used to suffer from asthma, and now he does ice baths and doesn't have asthma anymore. He posted this on Instagram. He says, over 100 people have messaged me and said the same thing. So I go to some of my friends who have really good track records of funding at the NIH, and I say, hey, couldn't we ask the National Institute of Health here? We're going to run some pilot. It'll only take $500,000. We'll do a pilot study. We'll get all the IRB human subjects things done. People will have, informed consent, and we'll study the relationship of cold plunge therapy with asthma. And they tell me the NIH is never going to fund that. I mean, it's just not the kind of thing that they do. And now we're right back to this competition between the high-tech, intellectual property-driven vision of healthcare versus the low-tech, back-to-nature. And how do we make that bridge? So I publish these stories, and people call them anecdotal. They say, well, that's not research, and I'm not allowed to argue. They say, that's not science. That's just a collection of anecdotes. But where do you think all the good hypotheses come from? If we see these sort of outliers over and over again, one of the most famous is Dean Hall, because he had leukemia and he had lymphoma. And this was sort of a chronic form of leukemia that doesn't kill you right away, but is going to kill you eventually. He went to his doctor and he said he'd already lost his wife to brain cancer. And he was a bit distraught with his own diagnosis. And he said, I want to do something to inspire other cancer patients before I die. And the doctor was like, I don't know, Dean, what did you have in mind? And he goes, I want to swim the entire length of the Willamette River back home in Oregon. And the doctor told him, if you so much as set foot in a public pool with your immune system in this degraded condition, it could kill you. And Dean said, so I guess you're telling me I don't have anything left to lose. He swam, it took him 3 weeks, 188 miles of that river. He went into hypothermia several times. He was not strictly medically supervised, but he wrote a book chronicling his experiences. And you can see when his doctor did come out, he estimated Dean was at 4% body fat, which is dangerously low, whether it's in a man or a woman. And maybe the estimate is off. But Dean must have been in a heavy state of ketosis and in and out of hypothermia the entire time. He went into that river with leukemia, and he came out of that river without it. Because when they rechecked his bloodstream, and his family was begging him to do this, he was like, hey, I feel pretty good. I don't really know. And they were like, no, Dean, you've just been through such an ordeal. You must get your blood measured again. No trace of leukemia anywhere in his blood. Now, that's an extreme outlier. And people say, that's not science. But then there was a group in Sweden, Secchi et al., and they took these mice. Remember, these lab mice, they are engineered to die of cancer. That's why we bring these mice into existence, so we can study them. The control group was kept warm. The experimental group, something like 4 hours of cold air every day. They wanted to study the impact of the cold exposure on the tumor growth. Guess which group lived longer? Because the cold exposed mice, the tumors grew more slowly. The survivability of the mice was extended, they had longer lifetimes. And the researchers hypothesized that it was because the brown fat in the mice was sucking the glucose out of the bloodstream and starving the tumor cells.
Was this cold exposure, or was this being constantly in a cold environment?
Acute and periodic, not constantly in a cold environment, because constant cold is a bad thing for your immune system. There's no recovery. Just like constant exercise can exercise people to death. Constant cold is constant stress. So in this particular study, I think it was 4 hours of moderately cold, not like freezing cold. It might have been 4 degrees C. And maybe to the mouse, that's not moderate at all, and I should just shut up. But it was periodic and acute cold exposure and then recovery. And they noticed that the mice live longer and the tumors grow more slowly. But then they replicated it. It's such a magnificent study. They took a Hodgkin's patient who had been through several rounds of chemo, but still had active tumor cells. And they said, we need to know if the same preferential glucose uptake into the brown fat is experienced in human beings. And so they injected them with the tracer that you use for these PET scans. And they put the human subject in the cold and they did the PET scan, and they found exactly what they were hypothesizing, that the brown fat preferentially takes the glucose out of the bloodstream and starves the tumor cells in a human being. So now we have the anecdote, and Dean isn't the only one. We have these people with these remarkable, we would call them miracles. And then the science comes in behind the anecdote and it says, we think these might be the mechanisms that explain what would otherwise just be a miracle. That's exactly the way science is supposed to work. So I'm going to keep publishing, we'll call them case studies, we'll call them anecdotes, whatever. But this happens in medicine all the time.
This is actually exactly what I'm interested in, because we're having a turning point, right? Like you said, ever since the pandemic, where we're not so blindly following just what Western medicine might say. At this point, I think people are ready to take their health into their own hands. There are so many people struggling and suffering who want a solution. And that takes us back to the consciousness aspect of water, right? We're ready. It's a tipping point right now. So we're ready to start looking at what actually it means to be healthy. And that is drastically probably very different from the way people live right now.
Well, I think you have to want it too, because there are so many people, like what with We Do, people are seeking for solutions. People are seeking for alternative approaches to whatever they're suffering with. But if you're not looking for it, you don't really know what to look for, what to do. So in terms of education and awareness, where do you believe it's necessary in health and education to start preparing our future generations? How do we inform them? How do we make them aware so that they don't have to want to be aware?
I think everybody needs a healthcare doula. And so I should explain this because, I got married, we're going to have a child. And I called my aunt, Penny Simpkin. And she wrote this book called Pregnancy, Childbirth, and the Newborn. She founded this organization called Doulas of North America. And so I'm like, I should see what Penny has to say. And Penny explained to me what a doula is. When a woman goes into labor, and for some reason in the United States, she's going to give birth in the maternity ward of the hospital, as if this was some kind of healthcare event. She goes into the hospital, and then all of a sudden she's bombarded with questions. Do you want a fetal monitor? Do you want an epidural? All these medical issues. She is in no mood to decide these things. She is not cognitively capable of the informed consent and all the different ramifications and the sequela of iatrogenic risks that she's taking when she says, yes, I will have an epidural. So Penny advocates that you have a birth plan. You figure out, here are all the possibilities. And everybody, might say, oh, I want to have a natural childbirth. And Penny would challenge me and challenge others. She would say, okay, I understand. But under what conditions would you consider a cesarean section? Because that might happen. And you should know, under what conditions would you consent to a fetal monitor? Which, I wasn't interested in, but, if this happens and this happens, I'm like, okay, that makes a lot of sense. We thought all of this out ahead of time. And then she said, this is the role of the doula. The doula knows your birth plan. The doula knows the decisions that the mother and the couple has made ahead of time. And the doula is there to advocate for a patient who is incapable of advocating for themselves. Holy smokes, Christina. What happens when you go to the emergency room and you're scared and you're frightened and you might be in shock and they start asking you questions? Do you want an X-ray? Oh, do you have any medical or pharmaceutical allergies or something like that? You have no capacity to fill out any of these forms or talk about insurance or make informed medical choices. So when I say you need a doula, it's because the centralized medicine plays upon the fears and the incapacity of the patient. When a man goes to his urologist and the urologist is like, well, your prostate, it seems a little swollen. All of a sudden, there's something that goes on in the man's mind. It's like, oh, what does that mean, doc? Is that bad? And the doc said, well, it's an indication that you could have prostate cancer, which we're seeing more and more cases of. And this is what can happen. And the man's like, well, I don't want prostate cancer. What do I do? He says, well, you should probably have the PSA taken. And then the PSA, like mine did, it comes back elevated. The next thing that happens is this guy goes online and WebMD convinces him that he's going to die of prostate cancer, because I've had exactly that experience. The Cleveland Clinic, Healthline.com, the Mayo Clinic. I'm not saying they're designed to do this. I'm saying they have the effect of doing this. These are all the things that could be wrong with you, and you're lucky if you're even going to make it to the hospital if you leave right now. I mean, this is just a catastrophic human mind happening, right? And in that moment of panic and fear and weakness, they sell you drugs, they sell you surgery, they sell you interventions. You are prone to what Gilbert Welch wrote a book called Overdiagnosis. You are prone to overdiagnosis. The best example with women is the early mammogram. There is no benefit to young women getting mammograms. And we have outstanding epidemiological data saying this. And it's not that, yes, we want to detect cancer early if we can, but overdiagnosis in young women is more dangerous than early detection is beneficial. And so on the whole, mammograms result in these iatrogenic outcomes in which the medical system is the cause of the injury. And why do women go do it? Because they're scared. Just like the man might have a biopsy of his prostate because he's scared, and they take 16 tissue samples out of the prostate, and the test is so unreliable, 4 or 5 of them come back as positive, and nobody knows whether this is a false positive and they say, but just to be sure, we're going to take your prostate out and you'll never have an erection again. These are the kinds of things that happen when your decision-making power is taken from you by the fears and the anxieties or the debilitated physiology of your disease. Your health maintenance organization doesn't give a crap. Your doctor, whom you want to trust in and you want to think is advocating for you, often is embedded in such a distorted incentive structure, including the risk of malpractice, that they're going to say, well, to be on the safe side, we'll have these tests. Your risk of overdiagnosis is extraordinary. And now medical errors are one of the leading causes of death in the United States, and nobody talks about it.
And that's also where, the cold plunging is so important, I think, because I love how you put out how the brown fat regulates the nervous system. And one of the things I noticed when I traveled to other countries is everyone seems to have like a much calmer nervous system, right, than the United States. And so I think that work too in regulating the nervous system, taking back your power of decision making, that is also what you're talking about a lot with the cold plunging. And that's also another benefit that I've experienced with it as well.
You bringing up a great point, because unlike white fat, brown fat is highly innervated. So there are like nerves that go through your brown fat. And that's because it is activated through the nervous system. There is not just a chemical relationship between brown fat and the brain, but I'll give you some examples. Higher levels of brown fat are associated with higher levels of brain-derived neuroprotective factor. This is a wonderful thing for your brain. Higher levels of brown fat are associated with higher levels of FGF21. So this is something growth factor, and I'm forgetting what the acronym stands for. But FGF21 protects your brain against injury, promotes recovery from injury, and is one of those neuroprotective factors that will prevent the onset of Alzheimer's or dementia. The brown fat and the brain are constantly working together through these neurochemical pathways. But what you just reminded me of is that they also work together through the nervous system. The vagus nerve, for example, represents the parasympathetic division, the rest and digest aspect. These are where the autonomic responses come from. You don't need to tell your heart to beat. You don't have to think about it because it's regulated by the parasympathetic division of the nervous system. Well, guess where cold and thermogenesis belong? Guess where shivering belongs? Same division. And so I don't know medically what this term vagal tone necessarily means, but there are people with low heart rate variability, with low parasympathetic function, and the cold can help them improve that function by exercising.
Is it cold and heat, or is it just with the cold?
What a good question. I'm going to answer this in a roundabout way because there's so much on social media right now about the benefits of sauna. And they say, look at these Finnish studies, and these scientists with these names like Laukkanen and Korhonen and stuff, and they're all coming out of Finland. And the Finns, they live longer and they're happier when they sauna. And they seem to forget that Finland is a cold country. In Finland, sauna is not just the hot box. It is the thermal contrast therapy. It's the going back and forth. You can't do an epidemiological study in Finland and say, we don't want anybody with cold exposure. We just want the people who are doing the sauna and then they never get cold, because that population doesn't exist. And so all of the referencing of the sauna studies that are coming out of Finland, they forget to say that sauna means thermal contrast, and they make it seem like all you have to do is get hot. Now, I live in the opposite of Finland. I live in Phoenix, Arizona. It is the hottest city, in North America. And people say, well, do you own a sauna? I say, no, I have a car. If I park it in the parking lot, I'm up to 180 degrees Fahrenheit. And I know the brominated flame retardants are not good for me, right? And all the other things, that new car smell is killing you. But I get plenty of heat. Just walking across campus, I get my heat exposure. What I don't have is an ice bath. So when I talk about the cold, in my case, I sort of take the heat for granted. I think that the combination of the hot and the cold, if you can't get the whole heat, at least get the red light portion of it. I think this is a much more powerful combination than people realize. However, in isolation, sauna likely has benefits. You just can't infer them from the epidemiological studies of Finland. And cold likely has benefits. The studies on cold exposure are, with some exceptions, exclusively cold. They say all we're doing is cold. What do we notice? And we see modulation of cortisol. Your cortisol's too high, cold brings it down. Your cortisol's too low, cold brings it back up. We see improvements in mood and mental health. We see an improvement in insulin sensitivity. We see instantaneous stimulation of endogenous ketone production, which is a wonderful thing for your brain. So we see improvements in metabolic flexibility. And sometimes we see improvements in autoimmune disorders and in gut. So I'm going to say, ideally, cold, hot, red light, UV, sunlight, good sleep, go for the whole grounding, go for, get your electrolytes, go for the whole thing. And a number of studies that look at cold exclusively in isolation still point to good metabolic and mental health benefits.
No, I definitely see the contrast therapy taking off. Very popular, and sounds like there's a lot of benefits to it.
There's something like 3.5 million sauna in Finland. And, we are so under hot there. What am I trying to say? There would be room for 300 million of them in the United States if Americans were going to start doing sauna at the same rate as the Finns do. Now, that'll probably never happen. But when you compare the health of the two populations, there's so many things going wrong in American healthcare. Our life expectancy has fallen off a cliff. And all the other developed nations have sort of recovered from the dip that they had in 2021. And they're sort of back to the regular levels, but America hasn't recovered at all. And I think it's because we are metabolically more dysfunctional than many comparable countries that that are Western, that are industrialized, that are highly educated, but somehow healthier than Americans.
Yeah, I think we'll see, but I think I honestly feel like it's a turning point right now, and I feel like it's like especially all the information you're putting out is really amazing, because I do feel like there's a huge movement right now, like currently, and getting the toxins out of the food, and then all these practices to increase the metabolic function and to. I keep thinking too, like just the consciousness is changing around health, because it has to. Like, we cannot remain this sick, right? We just can't. Like,
where do you see the field of cold exposure, I guess, research heading in the next few years?
There are so many questions that don't have good answers in cold exposure right now. The armies of the world have been studying cold exposure for a long time. So they're one of the leading funding agencies for cold, because they want to know how soldiers perform in the cold. And they don't have answers. There are not even any good mathematical models for heat extraction from the human body, because we can measure wind chill and we can measure temperature and we can measure a lot of things. But the human body has what are called thermoregulatory mechanisms. It will defend itself against the heat loss in extreme conditions. And what we still have a lot of trouble measuring is, how good is your vasoconstriction? How good is your cold thermogenesis? How good are the systems that you have in your body to maintain homeostasis in this extreme cold environment? So we can understand our bodies a lot better than we do. And that's not what I'm really, really concerned about. I'm a researcher. I am concerned about that. I want to do that research. But what really gets me is what Molly's talking about is the turning point. Did you ever think that we would have a presidential candidate, talking about seed oils? Like, how is that ever going to happen, where this is a totally new theme? We used to talk about healthcare policy, and it would be like, oh, big debate about Obamacare and who's going to pay for it, And that was the last time that healthcare was really a campaign issue. But now we've got, Bobby Kennedy Jr. saying, make health great again. And he's talking about sunlight and sleep, and he's talking about how bad statins are. And here's Joe Rogan saying, what do you think of seed oils there, President Trump? And he's going, oh, it sounds like a bad thing, There's some generational differences. My parents were told that margarine is healthier than butter. And so that's what they raised me and my sisters on. What a disaster. My parents were told that eggs will make their children sick. So they gave me Lucky Charms, as if, where was your intuition? But it's not what science was saying at the time. It's only now, 50 years later, that we're like, actually, saturated fat has an important role to play in your diet. And that coconut oil is pretty good for you. So I think there are 4 things happening, and they are a direct consequence of the lockdown policies that we implemented in response to COVID. The first thing is, nobody trusts the institutions of healthcare anymore. They don't trust the FDA. They don't trust the CDC. They don't trust the hospitals or the insurance companies, even if they have a good relationship with their personal physician and they feel like their physician is empathetic and caring. They don't trust any of the institutional apparatus behind that institution or behind that position. So that's one. The second thing is, everybody goes online now. It used to be like my mom or my dad, if they had a stomach ache for several days, they might make a doctor's appointment and they say, oh, what's going on in here? Nobody does that. Everybody, you got a headache, you're on WebMD, and you're convinced you have a brain tumor before you even know it, right? Because people do their online research before they consult with their physician, before they will make an appointment. The third thing is, artificial intelligence is changing everything. So this is a peer-reviewed study. They opened up a Reddit forum or some online forum like this, and they said people are going to ask health questions, and we're going to have an experimental group, which is an AI engine trained on all the medical literature to answer the question, and then we're going to have real physicians. And gosh darn it, the AI engine was rated as more accurate and more empathetic than the real physicians answering these online questions. And so what is this going to do to a general practitioner? AI can't do surgery yet, right? But what is it going to do to your ordinary sort of small town medical doctor? They're becoming obsolete. And the fourth thing that's happening is science is beginning to pay attention to this movement in what I'm going to call, for lack of a better term, biohacking. So we're now seeing journal articles that say, well, we used the Oura ring, or we used Whoop, or we're now studying red light. Like these technologies, including ice baths. I'm shipping an ice bath to a friend of mine, Marius Brozaitis at the Lithuanian Sports Academy, so that he can put human subjects in it and get better measurements of their cortisol and other adrenal responses. I think this is a wonderful thing because some scientists are starting to pay attention to what their patients are already doing and publishing the trials. You put those four things together and you can't have the same healthcare system that we sort of grew up in. There is going to be a sea change happening in healthcare. And I don't think it's going to be along the lines of this high-tech CRISPR gene editing personalized medicine. I think that the back to nature, what we'll call the wellness movement, will be the fastest growing and most important change in healthcare that we see in the rest of my lifetime.
Yeah, we fully agree. I'm always so thankful that people like you are being so vocal about some of these, anecdotal case studies, because it's what people need right now, right? We need to take our health into our own hands. So thank you so much for all this information. That was amazing. I love it.
You're welcome, Molly. It's a pleasure.
As we talk about the future of health, it's people like you who are pioneering like what the world can be and where we should go. So everything you're doing, we're so grateful, and just keep it going,
Going to do my best.
Yeah, we appreciate you and all the efforts. And thank you so much for joining us on our podcast today. It's been a real pleasure.
It's been a pleasure. Yeah. Thank you for having me on.
Thank you for joining us on today's episode of Centered Presents The Future of Health. If you're interested in learning more, please visit us at drmollybrown.com or email us at media@drmollybrown.com.